Hey, welcome to our webinar on why employees learn better and faster with VR training. To introduce myself, I'm Rich Striver, the head of customer success. And what that means is that we help set up Fortune 1000 companies to deliver VR training at scale. To talk about training for a moment, across the board, we're seeing that traditional methods of training are quite broken. They're ineffective or they're unscalable. There's also an all-around lack of engagement on the content, and retention of the material itself is spotty. Thankfully, there's a new way that we found to be very successful and innovative: immersive learning in VR, already adopted by dozens of members of the Fortune 1000. And before we introduce our guest today and unpack immersive learning and what that means, let me take a minute to introduce you to Striver. The company was incubated in the Stanford University Virtual Human Interaction Lab in 2015 to experiment with VR as a tool for training football players. With sports as a proving ground, we turned focus to how immersive technology could also improve learning in the enterprise. Today, leaders in the Fortune 500 like Walmart, Verizon, and BMW partner with Striver for immersive learning, a groundbreaking approach that combines VR with advanced learning theory, data science, and spatial design. Striver offers an end-to-end solution that consists of software and professional services in order to deliver the most effective and engaging immersive learning experiences. And with us today on the webinar is renowned expert on virtual reality, Jeremy Bailenson. Jeremy has led Stanford's Virtual Human Interaction Lab for over 15 years and studies the psychological and social effects that VR has on people and their perceptions of the world. He's the co-chair of the World Economic Forum's Global Future Council on Virtual and Augmented Reality. Research in his lab has helped set the foundation for Striver's founding, and he was personally instrumental in that process. Jeremy, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me, Rich.
Awesome. Well, let's jump in and talk about virtual reality. So lately, we've seen a huge interest in the media, from the Wall Street Journal to Fortune magazine, talking about VR and the impact it is making not only in gaming and consumer world, but on businesses today. Talk to us about why the news is coming up now. Is this a new technology, especially from an enterprise perspective?
So I've been studying virtual reality since the late 1990s, and there were others before me in the 80s, even as early as the 70s, when you think about where VR gets its roots. So we've been studying VR as a community for quite some time. And when you think about what really drives this technology, it's always been training. Since you have the flight simulator in 1929, why do you have a flight simulator? Because we learn by doing. We learn by making mistakes, getting feedback, and then repeating. That process is obviously very expensive when you're flying a plane. So hence we developed the simulator. And that mantra has been guiding the use of VR for quite some time. To get your question, which is, why are companies and news outlets fascinated by VR right now? It's because finally, we've been studying this for decades, but finally the hardware has gotten to a point where we can distribute this at scale and it's reliable.
That's great. It's great to hear. And so tell us a little bit more about this medium of virtual reality and why it might work so well for companies.
Virtual reality is a medium that engulfs the senses. What I like to say about VR is you should think about it as an experience, not as a media experience. When you're in virtual reality, you put on these goggles and the world disappears. There's no pixels, there's no field of view, all this jargon that we talk about. You're just having an experience. And the research we've done in my lab for quite some time shows that when you compare a virtual reality experience, say, to watching a movie or reading a manual, what you're doing is because you're actually moving your body and it's multi-sensory, where you're seeing and hearing and getting a little bit of haptic feedback, that it's experiential learning at its core.
That's really interesting, and I'm sure you might have some people viewing this webinar today that haven't yet gotten the chance to experience VR themselves. For those that have never tried it, maybe haven't tried it in many years in its current form, how would you describe the experience?
Let me answer that question by telling a story. Okay, in the year 2001, we flew my lab. I was at UC Santa Barbara at the time. We flew our heavy hardware all the way from California to Washington, D.C., where we presented at the Federal Judicial Center to try to teach federal judges and trial lawyers about how one would use virtual reality in the courtroom. Things like recreating crime scenes and having police lineups where witnesses, they look at suspects in the goggles. And one of the demos that we always show that is the feature of the story I'm telling now is called walking the plank. And in that instance, you put on the goggles, and you look around and you say, oh, this is kind of boring. I'm in the same room that I was a few minutes ago, and why is that an important VR experience? And we're tracking your movements. So if you're in a room and you move backwards, things over there get smaller, and if you move forwards, things over there get bigger. So the scene responds to your body. So back to this demo, we're here with all of these federal judges, and we have one federal judge who he's in this demo, we call it walking the plank. He's got the goggles on. We then hit a button and we drop a chasm. The chasm is 10 meters deep. It's about 3 meters to get across, and we put a little rickety wooden plank over there that he's got to cross. And in this demo, which is always, the first thing we show to get people to understand how intense virtual reality is, in this particular instance, we had a federal judge who was in his late 60s, a big man, and when he was trying to walk this virtual plank, he took a step to his left by accident. So we modeled gravity, and from his visual perspective and his auditory perspective, what he sees is himself rushing to the bottom of this pit. He dives at a 45-degree angle in the middle of this federal courtroom, and we had no idea that this was coming. His head was going towards this sharp corner of a table. Everyone in the room gasps, and we did our best to catch him, and he was okay. But the point of this story is that the number one thing you need to know about VR is that when it's done well, it produces something called presence. Presence is a fancy word for the illusion of non-mediation. When VR is done well, meaning it responds to your body movements, you've got a full regard system where you can turn around and there's things to see in all these places, the brain treats it as if it were a real experience.
Well, Jeremy, that sounds amazing from a learning standpoint around the plank, but maybe a little intimidating for some corporate environments and enterprise applications. I mean, what are some examples of how that same type of medium and experience might translate to the enterprise world?
Rich, exactly. The plank stays in my lab. We're not bringing that out to the corporations. But what we want to bring is that same intensity of a special moment that you see in the workplace. And so I think one of the great examples here is Holiday Rush from Walmart, which is, it's crowded, it's an intense day, and when I put on the goggles and I do Holiday Rush, my heart rate goes up, and everything that we've learned about how to measure the physiological signals, the brain science behind it, the nonverbal responses, we're taking that knowledge from things like the plank and applying them to situations that happen in the workplace, whether it is being in Holiday Rush or perhaps having a really difficult conversation with an employee where you have to deliver some news that may not be the best news. So the principles remain the same. We just tend to focus on much more real-world scenarios for the workplace.
And so as we know, many organizations have existing historical training methods that they've used for many years. And so what makes VR so different from how companies are doing training today?
There's a number of features of VR that make it a game changer for training. The first is you can do things that are rare. You can have a teachable moment that if you're going to do it in the real world, on the job, it would take months, maybe even years to happen. And this goes back to our football roots. We could in VR give a quarterback a play that he didn't see very often, and then he could go home and practice that play 100, 200 times. And I think the best thing to epitomize this kind of rare moment is training that we do with Walmart. And it turns out Holiday Rush only happens once a year. About half the employees have never seen it, so that's a rare event for them. So you can do things in VR that are rare, but still have this arousal level that the brain is treating it as if it's a real experience. Second thing about VR that makes it extremely special is when you do VR, you are activating the sensory motor cortex. And what I mean by that, if you're watching a video, you're not moving. In VR, you're actually doing the muscle motor movements that you would do if you were talking to a customer and gesturing, or when you're looking around a store to see if it's safe, you're actually doing those head movements in the same way you do them in the store. So because you're actually causing the neurons in the brain to fire that would actually fire if you were doing the real thing, it changes the way that this training resonates, because you're actually, there's a theory called embodied cognition, which is that part of the cognitive process of learning involves moving your body in the proper way, and where VR leverages that. The third thing is consistency. So I'm a teacher at Stanford, and I teach, every day I'm teaching some class or another. Every once in a while, I just crush it. I give the most amazing lecture, and I'm on, and every word matters, and I'm just seeing the room in a different way. And, I'm not saying on my bad day I'm terrible, but we certainly have days that are better than others. In VR, we always capture that perfect moment. So all training is, right now when you have a trainer, the trainers vary. Sometimes they're fantastic. Other people aren't as good in general, but even the woman who's the best trainer on the planet, she's going to have her good days and bad days. In VR, you're always having your very best day because we're choosing the content that fits. The fourth reason, if I can go on, I know that I'm kind of listing out numbers at you. Is that okay?
That's great. Yeah, this is very informative. Thank you.
Thank you. The fourth reason is it turns out the way that we learn best from a neuroscience standpoint is not the way we do it at corporations. So if you think about what I do at Stanford, we have a retreat once every 18 months where we think about issues of diversity, inclusion, and we spend, half of a day doing nothing but think about that. It turns out that is not the proper way that you learn. The proper way that you learn is by getting lots of small doses of learning spread out over time. So instead of doing it, once a year, you should be doing it fairly regularly and in much smaller doses. And what VR does, because you don't need to, rent out a facility or hire a person to do the work, you can actually implement training on the schedule that leads to optimal learning. And it's just unbelievably valuable to be able to do that. So one of the values we add when we work with our clients is not only giving content, but giving content that's meant to be spread over time. And let me be clear about that. We learn best when we get content that's similar a bunch of different times, but not exactly the same. And what VR allows us to do is to create that perfect learning scene and then change it up a little bit so that every single time you're learning on a schedule, it's a little bit different. So you're getting variance in the experience. Maybe it's in a different room or in a person who's a different age. And because of that variance, the lessons that you're learning are generalized. And it's really hard to do that in any way that I've seen outside of virtual reality.
Yeah, that's completely true. And it's something that we find often with some of our customers, companies that are implementing training in manufacturing environments. Some of our approach is to think about, hey, how do we combine the workflows and the schedules of your workers and how your employees clock in and clock out? When do they have time away from the floor to be able to train? And then make sure that we're proactive in designing, both the assessments up front, the trainings themselves, and then simulating assessments to make sure that they're retaining that knowledge and breaking that up into digestible pieces. So completely agree, and we'll be sure to touch on some of that methodology in more detail towards the end of the webinar. So some of what you're leading to also is a term that I think is coming to bear in the industry, immersive learning. And I was hoping, we mentioned it briefly before, I was hoping you could kind of define in your own words, how would you define immersive learning and what are some of the key components to creating a successful immersive learning program?
Look, the key for immersive learning is to start out by realizing it's not just the content. A cool demo does not make for immersive learning. There's really four components. The first one, it starts with instructional design. Let's take theories of learning. We know how the brain learns and we know how content can be engaging and produce learning transfer. Let's start there as you think about the content. The second is data assessment. So we are going to collect an amazing amount of data as people are going through this experience. And let's think about how to create experiences that allow us to infer things about were they paying attention to certain parts or not. The third part, of course, is VR, which is let's use everything we know about VR and let's make sure that it should be in the goggles and it's going to maximize everything that makes the goggles special. And finally, the fourth thing is spatial design, which is it turns out that you can design a scene, but designing a scene for VR is very different and you want to use the entire 360 space. You want to leverage everything about body movements that makes VR different from watching a movie. And the take-home message here is if you're not doing all four of these, you may be doing VR, but you're not doing immersive learning.
Absolutely. And I can also imagine how much it comes together where you're looking, where you're tracking your head movements, including the interactivity of the experience itself and the training, just adds to that next dimension of data. I think that is something that our customers find absolutely appealing about this new technology is the ability, you're not just talking about performance data of, okay, what did they score? What did they get right or wrong? But are they paying attention? Are they looking away when someone is trying to rob the store? Are they tracking the, the attributes of that suspect as they leave? All of these are things that we find really unlocked with this technology, and the analytics really are boundless in terms of what we can design and measure for success. So this learning by doing approach that we've been talking about with VR is what makes it so valuable for sports, for manufacturing environments, hands-on work. It makes complete sense. What about the other half of most jobs, and frankly, what we think the future is all about, the soft skill side, communicating with other human beings? What's the application of VR for that?
Yeah, when I think about applications of VR, I like to bin the world into before and after consumer revolution happened. So before 2013, 2014, VR systems cost tens of thousands of dollars. Of course, now they only cost a couple $100. And what I like to think when I'm looking for applications that are just home run VR applications, I like to always go to the past and say, well, what was working back in the early 90s when somebody had to buy a 6 or 7 figure system to justify the application? And one of them was social skills training. So taking someone, putting them in the goggles, putting them across from another person or other people, and letting them practice talking to those people, whether the context could be in all sorts of places, whether it's teaching or whether it's interpersonal communication, whether it's in a work context where someone's got to practice, say, doing a difficult conversation. Having people in a virtual room is always been one of the great applications. It just gives you practice to do things socially that might be hard to do in the real world.
It reminds me a lot of some other trainings that we've seen or customers and companies out there doing, whether it's tactically practicing some of those conversations, different tactics to de-escalate or things like that, or even creating simulations that allow the learners to walk in the shoes of another and kind of develop with perspective. And we found both methods really successful in driving home some of those skills, just albeit in different ways. So that's quite interesting. So I think what that reminds me of thematically is a big topic of today, which is empathy. So how does VR attack and tackle empathy? I mean, is that something that it solves for?
So one of the best applications in the world with virtual reality is this ability to get out of your body and to experience the world in a new way, and to do so in a way that leverages everything we talked about earlier that makes immersive learning so special. And so one of the first studies we published in 2005, based on a study that we built in 2003, was this idea: can you make someone more empathetic towards someone else? In this case, we were looking at people who are around 18 to see if we could cause them to become less ageist in how they thought about the elderly. And just putting them in a virtual reality scene, having them experience a scene from the perspective of someone else, in this case, someone who's much older, was the first time we ever showed that VR was more effective than other media, for example, watching a movie or imagining doing role playing, which is what we tend to do in corporations, at fundamentally changing the way you think, but more importantly, you behave towards others. So since that 2003 study, we've run dozens and dozens of experiments looking at all sorts of different contexts. And the take-home message here is, and I want our watchers and listeners to understand that virtual reality is not a magic cure to all things that we need empathy for. Nothing is. However, what our research shows, and we've got dozens of studies here, when you compare a virtual experience to imagining, role-playing, or doing the case study type web interfaces that I do at Stanford every 18 months to think about diversity and inclusion, that being there in VR causes people to fundamentally change the way they think and behave.
And again, I think that's really incredible, and it reminds me of sort of this idea between traditional training methods that might be aimed to tackle empathy and driving better empathy versus virtual reality. I mean, can you tell us a little bit more about why virtual reality as a medium just continues to be successful in this context specifically?
Look, virtual reality is not for everything. When I have, I'm at Stanford, the land of startups, and I would say I have about 20 people a month come to the lab. And when I say 20 people, I mean amazing Stanford undergraduates, and they're so brilliant, and they pitch me these ideas about, let's use VR for this. And most of them would be just fine if you used a different medium. Watch a great movie, or send out a web page on this. It turns out there's certain things for which VR is just an amazing, amazing use case. And becoming someone else or experiencing a scenario that really is crafted, using our spatial design and all the other principles we talk about to actually feel as if you are there with someone. It's just something you can't do in the real world. It's just not possible. So in general, we try to strive to use VR for things that really justify the medium. And this has just been, decades of research showing that this is one of the great use cases.
Yeah, and I think to touch on an earlier point about this technology being scalable and operationally effective, I mean, this seems like something that call center reps, employees, and frontline workers, anybody can experience over and over again. And I imagine, again, that repetition can only help deliver home that message and make sure that they retain that type of mindset for the customer or other situations.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that also resonates with some of the things we're saying some of our customers do today to develop empathy. Specifically, sometimes you might have call center, callers calling in, and they might be irate for any specific issue, and it's all too easy for those agents as they handle dozens and dozens, maybe of the same type of call, to kind of look at that as a rote kind of subject and just handle things very transactionally. But we found that Verizon in particular has designed some of their simulations to allow that call center agent to walk in the shoes of some of their callers and really see, very, tangibly, what is it that that person might be going through as they're calling in, and hopefully drive some of that understanding and that empathy of walking in the shoes of another. And so that's something that they've created. What connections, Jeremy, do you see to the science behind why that might work?
Look, we can't fly every single person in a call center to meet every single client. It's just not going to work, and it would be horrible for climate change and the planet. However, we can do the next best thing, which is give them experiences where they gain a new perspective. And the neuroscience behind this on something called body transfer, which is when you're having this, embodied experience that's spatial and that's immersive, that it's causing the brain to change a bit, and it's causing the scenario to be experienced in a way that, look, nothing is the best, nothing is going to match flying and having dinner with one of your clients for 3 or 4 hours, but this actually gets you close, and it gets you close in a way that's much more efficient.
Yeah, and I also imagine for companies, it's a very safe way to practice. I mean, you don't necessarily want those agents practicing on live callers, actual customers with issues, in the same way that safe environments for retailers means not having them practice when there's actual shooters or things like that, in the building.
It goes back to the flight simulator. Why do you have it? Because you want to try. You want to try a bunch of times, make mistakes when you're practicing, get feedback on those mistakes, and try it again. And so that's, the flight simulator is a perfect metaphor for the social skills trainer because, we need to practice and we need to feel free to try different things and to repeat, 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 get feedback, take that feedback, and that's how we learn.
Absolutely. That's a great lead into the last part of our conversation. You've given us some great examples of how different companies and even the research, utilizes the benefits of VR. So I'm sure people viewing have their own ideas in mind, are itching to get started, and their minds are racing. That's what I love personally about this medium of VR, is it really expands the ideas and the options out there. But how would you help them figure out how to get started, what to do with this VR training? What questions would you advise people to ask themselves as they're thinking about identifying the right use case to use VR for?
Yeah, Rich, I think that's the right question. So earlier I talked about one of the big ones, which is don't just use it gratuitously, try and solve a problem. Okay, let's use VR to try to solve a difficult problem as opposed to we've got these goggles that are kind of cool. The second part of that is let's really think through the end-to-end system. So yes, we've got to build the content. You've got this great piece of content, but how are people going to use it? How often are they going to be using it? How are you going to incentivize them to use it? What data are you going to collect? How are you going to analyze that data and to make decisions based on that data? There's, a long life to this when it's done well. And the smart people who use this don't just think about let's make a cool experience. Let's go through that entire end-to-end process and to think ahead to maximize it at every step.
Yeah, it's a good point. And, in our world, as we talk to different enterprises that are itching to get started, it's really easy to just see the headsets and the content and think that those are the only two components that you need to think about. But, despite all these advancements in the VR science, how cheap it is now, how easy it is to scale, there is a lot that goes into it, and as we kind of unpack some of the components of our methodology, we touch a little bit on strategy, making sure that what you're designing has an end goal in mind, is tied to some business goals, and is really trying to make an impact to your organization one way or another. That's, I think, the paramount in the first place to get started. We talked a little bit about the content design itself, but even producing it, and where does this content go? How do you manage this content as it floats out there in the wild with all the different headsets that are now needing to be established at all the training locations? There's an operational planning element as well. And you mentioned as part of immersive learning, interactivity and instructional design, and making sure it's not just a cool or nifty experience or simulation, but it's actually teaching you something. And that requires a lot of forethought as well. And finally, we did touch on data analytics and making sure that you create, what is the bar for success with this? How do we make sure that the investment that we're putting into this technology and this experience is actually going to be paid off? And so there's definitely a lot of thought that goes into that. There's a need for both VR expertise and behavioral learning expertise. And what we find is that companies often have one or the other, but perhaps not both. And fortunately, that's where Striver's been able to help.
No, you're talking about the operational side. I mean, I just want to, if I can tell a story here, one of the first NFL teams that we installed a dedicated room to, like a VR, great room, like padded walls, a floor painted. It was like the first VR NFL room in history. It was amazing. And I'll never forget, I was down there with Derek where we installed this system and just got it installed. And remember, I'm a professor, I've got this fancy lab, and we're just kind of, it's the first consumer VR system that's out there. Football player comes in the room, there's our VR system, and I'll never forget, the quarterback, he takes his ice cream and he sticks his ice cream right on top of the laptop, and I watch all this ice cream dripping all over the VR system. Oh no! But that's what we have to deal with at scale, right? So now translate that into millions of people currently using Striver trainings across its, there are so many things that need to be done, the little things to make this stuff work at scale. I've been studying VR for 20 years, and I often say, I would never have expected 20 years ago for the case of VR becoming democratized, meaning it is everywhere and everyone's getting to do it, was going to be using a retail store like Walmart. It was just not what we would have thought back then, but the lessons learned along the way to bringing VR to 1 million employees in the year 2019, it's just mind-boggling.
For sure, and there's definitely a lot of proper planning and things that hopefully prevent things like ice cream meltdowns and stores.
Be able to survive the ice cream test because this is what at scale.
Absolutely. Well, hey Jeremy, thanks for such great insights. As we wrap up, I just wanted to maybe recap on a couple of the key takeaways that we had today. First, that people learn most effectively by doing. This is why virtual reality as a medium is so powerful. The ability to establish that presence, to go through those repetitions, very effective, engaging, and consistent as a training tool, and truly a step change above a lot of the traditional methods of training through webinars, potentially classrooms, things like that. Second, VR gives employees a chance to practice and build soft skills like empathy and de-escalation skills in a safe and simulated environment. And especially as we go towards this future of the knowledge worker, this trend of automation, those skills can only become more important for companies to preserve and empower their employees with. And finally, immersive learning is more than just the content you see or the headsets themselves. As you were saying earlier, it requires careful evaluation of how is this an instructional tool, what are the design elements that make this interactive and take advantage of that medium, and also careful implementation of where this technology is housed, used, maintained, managed. All of those need to go into making this program operationally successful. And that's why Striver exists, is to really help Fortune 1000 companies offer this type of immersive learning at scale. Well, in terms of next steps for all of you listening out there, if you're interested in learning more about the different types of VR training that are currently deployed across many industries, visit striver.com/resources to find ebooks around safety, employee experience, operational efficiency, as well as reports about the science behind VR training. There are also easy ways to contact us if you're interested in dialoguing on how we can help you get started to bring immersive learning to your enterprise. Well, Jeremy, thanks again for your time. Hope you have a good one.
Thank you, Rich. Great stuff.